following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
That an economy functions that I think is kind of, it's interesting to play with. You could think of ways that maybe tokenization or blockchain would factor into that in terms of how would you go about thinking about the ownership of a job and the ways that you distribute resources on the basis of job categories and so on.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time, lost between the past and future.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Kean Birch, Director of the Institute of Technoscience and Society and Professor in the Graduate Program in Science and Technology Studies at York University, Canada. Kean is an accomplished and thought-provoking scholar in many important topics, including personal data, innovation, big tech, and assetization. I invited him onto the podcast to discuss his academic journey, his research contributions, and his perspectives on crypto and Web3. And throughout the discussion, Kean will share a wealth of knowledge and information related to these and many other evolving fields. As always, we start by discussing Kean's educational background.
Sure. My background's kind of interdisciplinary. So I started out in sociology. Oh, it's quite a long time ago now, thinking about it. Yeah, started in sociology, and that got me into something called science and technology studies, which is a social studies of science, technology, innovation, that sort of thing. And then after that, I worked in the real world for a little bit. And then I went back to academia and did a PhD in regional planning. Slightly different, but I kind of moved in and out of fields for a bit and keep doing that, I guess, actually. So I've not stopped. Yeah.
What pulls your interest early on in your life to sociology? That's not a major program that I've had on the podcast before.
I look back at my career and I think a lot of it is kind of happenstance, accident, and luck. I got interested in sociology in high school, actually, because my high school had an A-level sociology program. So in the UK, A-levels are your final 2 years of high school. So when you're sort of 17, 18, they're the kind of qualifications you do then. I started out by choosing to do Latin, history, and English. First week, I decided that Latin wasn't for me, and I switched to sociology because a friend was doing it, and he said it was interesting. And I was interested in kind of like social issues, political issues. And so I thought, okay, I'll do sociology. And then I came to university to do Japanese, so another language. And after the first year, I basically failed my first year in Japanese. And luckily, the university I was at is the University of Edinburgh. It has a 4-year program, and you do 3 courses in your first year. And one of them was sociology because I'd done it at A-level in high school. And so my second year, I switched and went from there basically. So, yeah.
And so obviously your background in education, you're interested in a lot of different fields, and you end up pursuing a PhD in regional planning. So again, another GRT IQ podcast first. What is regional planning? What are the types of things you worked on in a PhD program like that?
This is an interesting difference between North America and Europe, I think, and other parts of the world, I guess. So in Europe, there's much more distinct regions in countries. So while in the US, you might have states, and Canada, you might have provinces. In Europe, each country is effectively probably often the size of a state or a province, and each of them is broken down into smaller regions. And so regional development really is looking at the regional economies in these regions and to try and understand the industrial structure of those regions, how that industrial structure has changed over time, why employment is rising or falling, what are the levels of investment, what are the kind of industries that exist in different regions, and so on. So that's kind of what regional planning is about. There's a whole area called regional studies, which is a kind of subfield in geography or economic geography. And that's what I went and did. And I was interested primarily because of my earlier background in science and technology studies. I was interested in biotechnology clusters. This is a big question at the time I went to do my PhD. It was early 2000s, so 2002. Why does the biotechnology industry cluster in certain parts of the world. And in the UK, it was Oxford and Cambridge and a little bit up in Scotland. In the US, it's primarily Boston and California. So why those parts of the world? Why do biotech firms set up there? Why is all the money there? Why is the regional infrastructure institutions, how do they support these clusters and so on? So that's what I was doing. And I was interested in that kind of technology side of things, the biotechnology, as well as the, understanding the kind of political economy of the biotechnology in those particular regions.
In a sort of back of napkin type of way, I mean, what are the insights there? What is the going academic explanation for the emergence of these clusters?
Well, that's there's not one explanation. So, after reading, thousands of things during my PhD, the conclusion is that there are many different possibilities, I guess, and different perspectives on why. Some of them are related to, I guess you'd call them sort of structural features of the industry. Certain firms set up in certain regions that attracts other firms. There's lots of integration between the firms in that they have, these supplier linkages, things like that. Then there are other reasons which tend to be sort of treated as more kind of social reasons. So, you have individuals who are seeking employment in these firms know that if they go to a region, there will be lots of jobs. And so if they lose their job, they can move to another job pretty easily. And so that's another kind of reason. And then there are other ones which are slightly more abstract around notions of proximity, the idea that if you have all these people in one location, there's a lot of shared knowledge and a lot of shared kind of tacit understanding of how to do things, that happens through people's informal networks as much as their formal kind of, networks and so on. So all of this put together, it sort of explains why these kinds of regions appear.
And so at this point in your life, then pursuing a PhD in this type of program, what are you envisioning for your career?
I think I decided I wanted to be an academic at the end of my undergraduate. So in my fourth year, I liked what it seemed the professors were doing. I liked the idea of spending my time reading and thinking and writing and that sort of thing. And so that was my ambition, was to get an academic job. You have to do a PhD to get one. So I undertook this PhD. It was funded, meant that I didn't have to pay for anything myself. And there was support for me to do the research. And my goal was to do it as quickly as possible and to move on into the academic career ladder. Yeah.
And that's clearly what you've done. And we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about some of the research that you've pursued. And I think my listeners are going to find a lot of interest in the major themes that you're studying. And they certainly carry over into the Web3 blockchain space, which again will be super interesting for listeners. Before we get there, though, I do want to ask you this question about some of the pros and cons then of working in academia. I think I myself, for example, have romanticized being a college professor. It always looks super interesting. And I've had other guests on the podcast that came from academia and eventually went into the private sector. But talk to us about your experience. What are some of the pros and cons?
For me, academia's pros are to do with the kind of levels of autonomy that you have. You decide what you're going to do research on. You decide, to a certain extent, what you're going to teach. You decide, how you're going to do these things as well. So you have a lot of autonomy and a lot of creativity is involved in that as well. So you can be developing your own ideas, pushing them forward and getting the support to do so. In many ways, that's the kind of epitome of a good academic system, is provide that space for people to go and do what they're interested in without really needing to almost justify it in economic terms. The downside, I think, is, at least since I probably got my permanent position, so I first got a permanent position in 2009. And since then, I think academic systems and academic institutions have been gradually defunded, gradually faced a series of crises almost, and gradually sort of undermining that kind of ideal of the academic life where you work autonomously and doing the research that you want to do with the academic freedom to do it and to teach and so on. North America, Canada, the US, a lot of academia is now split. It's kind of bifurcated between people who are very precarious on very precarious contracts, and then people who have the kind of more secure tenure track contracts. And that's been increasing. So there's a kind of increasing inequality within the academic system itself. And I think that has negative impacts on the functioning of universities and the future of the university system, as it were. I don't think that's beneficial to students. I don't think it's beneficial for the societal role of universities either.
Is this just a bump in the road of a story that we all kind of know how it ends, or is this somewhat of a pivot point where maybe universities across the world are experiencing a fundamental change?
I think that the future of the university will be decided in the next 10 years. And if, societies decide that they don't want to fund universities on an ongoing basis and they prefer universities to be funded much more through student fees, for example, things like that, then we're on a track to a significant change in the way the university systems are set up. They'll shift more towards teaching-focused institutions, much more focused on employability, all these sorts of things that generally, at least in the Canadian setting, usually happens in colleges. So that's another kind of tertiary education institution. And the role that universities has will kind of shrink as in the research sense, I think. There's reasons for this. And I think that the major driving reason is that over the last probably 2 decades or so or more, there's been a shift away from central government funding, provincial, state government funding towards student fee funding. And that has a very fundamental impact on how universities are held accountable. So universities are no longer held accountable to a more centralized, kind of government or agency or what have you, a collective kind of agency, and much more accountable to students. And so you have this kind of shift in the way that impacts what we do and the way that universities are treated and understood in the rest of society.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, DApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTIQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the Graph.
Roger that.
That's an amazing perspective, and I appreciate you sharing some of that here. And it'll be interesting to watch and see as that story evolves. When we return back to then your career decision, staying in academia, you developed some research topics and specialties. And so, if you don't mind, can you just sort of introduce us to some of the topics of study and research you've pursued in your career?
Sure. I'll talk a bit about what I'm doing now, what I'm interested in now. I think that's a good starting point. So I'm obsessed with assets. That's an easy way to start. I don't know why, but this is part of being an academic. You can be obsessed with random things, and maybe down the line it'll become important and interesting to other people who read about your work, which has happened, which is nice. So I'm obsessed with assets. I don't have an origin story for why I'm obsessed with assets. I think it goes back to my research on the biotech industry, and I started getting interested in intellectual property rights. And so I had that interest, and I think then it kind of expanded into a kind of interest more broadly in kind of intangible resources and knowledge capital, these sorts of things. And there was a lot of debate about this towards the end of my PhD and at the end of the 2000s that I started getting very interested in. Then subsequently have become more and more interested in just trying to understand and unpack what an asset is, what makes them different from, say, other kinds of political and economic objects and forms, and so on. To be very kind of simplistic about it, an asset is something that can be owned or controlled, that provides future benefits for the entity that owns or controls it, and it will provide those benefits over a period of time. So those are the general kind of characteristics of an asset. That's in accounting terms. So that's not just me making that up. That's the kind of accounting way of understanding what an asset is. And that all matters because an asset gets treated differently than other kinds of political economic objects, like a product, that you might make or a service that you might provide. And so there's different kinds of dynamics involved with an asset than there are for, a good product or service. One kind of example of that dynamic is with kind of mainstream economic assumptions. If demand for a product or a service increases, that attracts new providers who will come in to provide more products and services, lowering the cost of those products and services. With an asset, it doesn't quite work that way. If demand for the asset increases, there may be no way to provide more of that asset, and so the price of the asset just goes up. And so you can think of housing as an example of an asset where demand rises, and that forces up the price, the value of the asset itself. You don't get this kind of balancing effect. And for me, I think that the asset form, the asset as a kind of focus of our economies has become increasingly dominant over the last 20 years or so. And so we're in a situation now where our economy is increasingly sort of shaped and configured. I like the word configured by the pursuit of assets and the impact of them on our economies and societies and so on. It's in multiple dimensions. That's not just in kind of economic terms. Assets are also the kind of logics that exist that shape assets and shape the ways that we think about the world as assets, also shapes, our own individual thinking about ourselves and our lives. We might think of education, for example, as investing in an asset, or buying a house as investing in an asset. So, we get the rise of things like human capital, for example, as being this kind of notion of how we should think about ourselves, think about ourselves as human capital that we're investing in. And it also shapes political decisions. So the UK, there was a big, back in the 2000s, late 2000s, I guess, there was a big shift in the way that housing assets were treated. And so there was a shift in kind of treating them as almost an investment in your retirement, a sort of retirement fund. So instead of supporting good pensions that everyone could have in their retirement, there was an expectation and a push behind people buying housing as a way to secure their retirement, because then they could sell it and live off the money that they got from it, essentially. And so there's this notion of asset-based welfare that emerged at the time. What I find really interesting about assets is how they're made. Coming from this science and technology studies background, its short form is STS, or this acronym is STS. So from this STS background, people in STS are very much interested in how technologies are constructed and how science evolves and develops, thinking about the social, political, economic drivers that kind of, again, configure it, right? And this is a two-way process in the sense that, society shapes science and technology shapes society. So STS scholars are very interested in how things are constructed and constituted. And for me, that's what I'm interested in when it comes to assets. How are assets made? We can't assume that they just exist. They have to be made and configured and created. And so how does that happen? And this is what I've termed assetization. So this process of the transformation of things into assets. And you can look at various different dimensions of this process and break it down into understanding, what are the technical elements of it? What kind of technologies help you or devices help you create an asset? It could be social, what kind of social narratives and so on helps you turn things into an asset, like human capital, for example. It could be legal. So what are the kind of property rights that you need in place, or what are the kind of contractual arrangements that you need in place in order to turn something into an asset, and so on. So you've got all these kind of different components that are part of turning something into an asset. So at the minute, I'm really interested in the way that personal data is being constructed or constituted as an asset. It's very interesting, personal data, specifically digital personal data, because it's really interesting because it can't be owned. So legally, you can't own facts about things. So you can't own the fact, that your name or your age or, things that are, factual. So you can't own that information. But you can actually still turn it into an asset with the right kind of social and technical arrangements that enable you to extract value from that. That, I think, is what big tech has been doing for the last however many years now, they've been collecting an enormous amount of data and combining it, aggregating it, and turning it into a very valuable set of assets that they control. They don't necessarily own it, but they control it. And they, funnily enough, or I'm not sure it's a contradiction, but they can talk about privacy rights as a reason for why, they can't share it, right? So you get this kind of interesting dimension where we've collected all this data and we're using it, but we can't share it with anyone because of privacy. So there's a really interesting kind of, I don't know what you call it, switch in terms of turning privacy back in on itself in a way. Data is really fascinating, and as well as not just because of the personal, that kind of personal information, but also the way that big tech companies and others that emulate them are, collecting an awful amount of data about our kind of use of things. There's an enormous amount of value behind collecting that data on user engagement, technology use, where we click, what we like, all that sort of stuff, what we comment on, how much we'll spend on an in-app purchase, all that becomes very, very valuable and can be hoarded. And, you can sell access to it to others who might want access to that kind of information for looking for customers and so on. So you can think of data in the same terms, how I defined an asset, you can think of it in the same terms. It's something that can be controlled. It's something from which you can get future benefits, not all of which is to do with advertising, could be to do with the development of a product or a service. It lasts for a long time. You have people sign up to hand over their personal data through terms and conditions agreements that give perpetual control, essentially, to companies to use the data as they see fit for as long as they want. What I also find interesting here about personal data is that even though it's incredibly valuable, it's an asset, it's not recorded on balance sheets. So you don't have, if you look at an annual report, a financial report for a big tech company, you look through their earnings scores, you don't see them talking about, and we have 1,000 terabytes of data from all our users and so on and so forth. Well, actually, Google's an interesting one because Google specifically says on its website, we don't sell your data. It's spelled out there, right? So they're selling something, they're monetizing the data somehow, but they're not selling your data. So it's not recorded on their balance sheets. And so we don't have any kind of transparency about, how much data is held by who, what they do with it, all these sorts of things. And as a consequence, I think that they get away with a lot more, can't be held to account and all these sorts of things that if it was clear and transparent, then, we would be able to say this company has this much data about this kind of activities and so on. And let's maybe think about, should they have that? Should we let them have that data? So that's another interesting side to personal data as an asset, how it gets governed and how that is very untransparent. Interestingly, governments are also very interested in personal data, and international organizations are very interested in personal data because they realize it's an increasingly important asset, right? If it's an increasingly important asset, how do governments tax it? How do governments tax its economic impacts and effects, right? So if it's not recorded on balance sheets, there's no transparency about it. And you can see a big difference in the market capitalization of a big tech firm versus other kinds of firms that have recorded their assets on their balance sheets. And you see a huge difference in the kind of multiple of the recorded assets versus the market capitalization there. It's important for governments, international organizations, and so on to understand how data is an asset and how it is valuable and how it is understood as being valuable. Well, there's international efforts to try and create standards and harmonize standards around how to treat data as an asset. There's all sorts of esoteric, arcane, national accounting kind of standards and debates going on right now about revising these national accounting standards. Again, this goes back to why being an academic is, I can enjoy being an academic because it gives me the autonomy to look into very, very often ignored kind of topics where, there's something called the System of National Accounts, which is this harmonization standard, national accounting standard. I don't really see it being discussed very much, but it underpins all sorts of national measurements of GDP. And this is where they come up with, what GDP is. This is how they conceptualize it and define it in these national accounting standards. Their decisions about what conceptually fits in what category reshapes our GDP, a measurement of GDP, which has these knock-on effects on policy, knock-on effects on business, knock-on effects on individuals. But it's often these obscure kind of standards just don't, we don't really see them because they don't appear to be important. So That's, some of the things, I've been thinking about. I think that national accounting standards issue is a kind of indication of the fact that assetization doesn't just entail the construction of assets, the transformation of things into an asset. It also entails the governance of the economy, right? So the way that we treat different political economic objects as an asset or as a intermediate good or as a final good or whatever, that changes the way we govern societal resources. So if you move something from being an intermediate good into being an investment, that shifts the way we treat different things. So personal data will be treated differently as a consequence of the fact that they're trying to frame it as an asset. And that will mean that there will be a different set of the governance of data. Personal data will change, and it will shift as a consequence of this recategorization or simple categorization. And it will change the way we understand it and govern it and manage it.
There's a lot to go through there, and we're going to unpack some of that. And it's amazing research. And I want to then bolt on this additional idea as we explore some of those themes, which is of a lot of interest to listeners of this podcast, which is this idea of Web3, blockchain, crypto assets. And so if we go back a little bit in your story here, do you recall when you first became aware of what was happening in Web3 or with cryptocurrencies?
Aside from something being written about in the newspapers, the first kind of indication that it might have meaning beyond a news story, I guess, in our lives, if you like, was when I was teaching a graduate course in the political economy of Technoscience back in, I think it was 2014, 2015. And a student there was very, very keen on Ethereum and tried explaining it to us and tried explaining its use cases. At that point, I don't think it was necessarily economic. I think it was more, how can you construct communities almost, I think. And it sort of went over my head. I guess a more relevant one might be to do with assetization again. I'd been co-organizing a panel on assetization at a conference in Barcelona. I sent my colleague, a guy called Fabian Miniza, who's another STS scholar. I'd sent him an email about a company that I'd just read about called Rakugo. I'd been intrigued by, I think it was their press release launch or something like that, where they're trying to explain what they're doing. And it seemed to me, this is assetization, right? They may have used that term. I can't remember. They were trying to use tokenization to reward or pay content producers for the content they produce for their website. So they would give tokens to content producers who would write articles or, whatever it is on their website. And then they would try and generate income and revenues by advertising or subscriptions or, whatever it was. And then they would distribute a proportion of that income to the content producers who held tokens, depending on how many tokens they held. And I think you got so many tokens for, so many words or something. So there was this, I guess, a quid pro quo there going on. I think they were looking for some form of financial backing to invest in their company. It didn't go anywhere, I don't think, the company itself. But it was an interesting kind of insight into what blockchain and tokenization, things like that, were about and how they might relate to what I was interested in.
And so as time has gone on, clearly cryptocurrencies have evolved and they're more than just a news story now. There seems to be an entire industry building and surrounding this. How has your thinking on cryptocurrencies, blockchain, and assetization changed over time as well?
I come at it, I think, from probably not necessarily from the crypto side of things, but from the kind of tokenization NFT side of things. When that kind of NFTs exploded, I guess 2020, something like that, right? That was also really interesting from my perspective, thinking about these digital assets and how do you create them and construct them and how do they have value and how do people understand them as valuable and how do people make money from them, really. That was really interesting for me to think about, again, this kind of what are the technical components of this assetization process here and how does, things like tokenization, the construction of that, how does the kind of fractional ownership work and how is that different from, other kinds of fractional ownership like share ownership and what are the different kind of intermediaries that are involved. And so, thinking about the difference there, share ownership versus tokenization. With share ownership, you need a lot of intermediaries. You need market makers, you need brokers, things like that in order to launch, to do an initial public offering, to trade and sell. Often you need trade and sellers. Well, with tokenization, you have a much more, you could call it democratic kind of system where anyone can buy and sell tokens. And so you have this different kinds of fractional ownership that have potentially very different implications for the ownership of things. But NFTs still seemed a little bit sort of dodgy. I don't know if that's a yes. So it always seemed a little bit like, I don't know what's going to happen with these, but I don't think the kind of hype around them and the bubble that blew up around them, I think was kind of to be expected. Part of that could be related to the Facebook shift into Meta and the metaverse and the way that kind of generated a lot of interest in digital products, digital assets, and so on. The kind of demand increase in those kinds of things at the time. So I think there's some interesting kind of relationships there. When it comes to crypto, I really wasn't paying a ton of attention to things like Bitcoin and things like that, aside from the kind of, the valuation is going up. What I didn't really understand, I guess, was how people converted ownership of Bitcoin into something in the real world, right? You own Bitcoin and you're not going to sell it because it has value and you're going to retain it. And, how do you then use that and convert that into something that is livable income, if you like? And so that always really intrigued me. And that, what are cryptocurrencies? Are they assets in which you can use as collateral to borrow money and to live on, and then you pay off that debt as you need as you go along? Or are they something else entirely? They're not clearly, I don't think clearly fit within the kind of asset realm, because they are obviously a form of money as well. And so there's they're kind of funny, a funny kind of asset, like money, I guess. Yeah.
As someone who's working in a field that studies these types of things, the characterization, the definition, the structure of what makes something an asset, is it too early to say if cryptocurrencies are an asset class in and of themselves, or is the narrative changing such that we should take this more serious?
What makes them peculiar is the fact that the idea that you don't have third parties. Third parties are not essential to ownership and to control of them, right? So while with other kinds of legal property regimes, a third party is an essential component in that property regime. So I think that's partly what makes them peculiar, and partly what makes them difficult to kind of assign that kind of asset status to as well. Going forward, I think blockchain itself, NFTs, tokenization, some form of technical property configuration again, will provide really interesting kind of new political economic objects, very embedded in the kind of digital infrastructures that we have, that open up a series of things and a series of experiences, a series of events and so on, to a new kind of way of understanding them as economic, as of worth. And so one of the interesting things I heard about last year was, I think it was the construction of NFTs for the Australian Open, where they constructed a series of digital tennis balls, I guess. And I can't remember if you had to buy one or if you got one because you attended or what have you, but each tennis ball was attached to, don't quote me on this. So I think each tennis ball was attached to a particular inch or centimeter of the court, right? And then every time that part of the court was hit, tennis ball would record another kind of hit. So you'd have different tennis balls would have different numbers, I guess, attached to them, to depending on how often they were hit. So that kind of thing is, it's interesting. It's an interesting way of thinking about the experiences we have going to a tennis match, thinking about that differently than just simply us paying to go to a tennis match. We're now thinking about, what's the kind of meaning of that experience in economic sense. Is that that shared experience that we have? Is that going to be something that somebody in the future is going to be really obsessed with and want to, buy all those tennis balls and, willing to pay whatever to people who were there and that sort of thing. So there's a whole range of new kinds of social, relations, interactions, events, things, all these sorts of things that can again be configured as something more than they currently are as a result of this kind of technical, and other kinds of components to arranging them as an economic object. Yeah.
So I want to go back then to what you said earlier about this relationship between society and the development or innovation in science and technology. And you said something to the effect of, these developments reflect society and society sort of reflects these developments. And when you talk about big data, when you talk about big tech and the emergence of blockchain, how do you make sense of that? I mean, do you see this as an interplay where there was some movement, maybe some revolt, if you will, against big tech and what they were doing with data?
I'm not sure I have a lot of insight on this. I've not studied blockchain as a kind of movement or, that sort of thing. To me, it seems that blockchain was around before the techlash, as it were. So I think most people were pretty happy with big tech up until 2016, 2018, right? So there were a few very critical people, but it wasn't this to the extent that we socially, collectively has that kind of backlash that emerged in the late 2010s. There will be people in the blockchain movement who I'm sure were reacting against the hoarding of data and the collection of data and so on. But I'm not sure to what extent it is a direct kind of cause and effect of it. I'm not sure if you know, or if you have any kind of perspectives on that.
Well, I think that's the question, and I'm curious about it at a sociological level as well as like an economic level. But this idea that industries may spring occasionally from disgruntled societies or people who want to see change. I mean, I think history probably reflects that is the case on occasion. And so one wonders if the emergence of blockchain and this Web3 industry is in response to what we've seen with big tech and personal data. But of course, the story is still being written. From your perspective then, as a scholar in the field, what do you say to people who, for the most part, are pretty cavalier about big tech and personal data, that those terms and conditions you referenced earlier, we don't read them, we just click accept and move on. Are we too cavalier, or should people be more concerned or cynical?
I think one of the things we have to remember is that the kind of strategies that big tech has used have changed and evolved over time. So it's not that simply this was the state of play back in the early 2010s or late 2000s when we first had smartphones, first emerged and developed and so on. And you had Facebook launching, more broadly than the universities, and Gmail being launched as well. All those things I think happened in 2007, maybe 2008. At that time, you had a lot of new things that seemed pretty, interesting and so on. But when Facebook launched, I think other people have stated, it launched on the basis of, we're unlike MySpace, we're actually going to look after your privacy. We're going to treat your data, with proper kind of privacy concerns. So actually, it started very differently than it is now. And I think that's possibly one of the defining features of, big tech, other kinds of digital technologies, is the pivot. So there's a lot of change that goes on within these firms, and as they look for a business model that generates the revenues that leads to growth and leads to scale and leads to market dominance, that they have kind of focused on as their goal. I think gradually we can see that, the ways that they've changed over the last, let's say, 15 years. And we can see that in the ways that they've shifted their products, shifted their terms and conditions, shifted, privacy policies, shifted all their kind of, innovation objectives. All these sorts of things have shifted gradually over time as they've changed, and they've become the huge behemoths that they are. Right. That's something that's gradually happened. And that means that often, we start out with a very different experience and very different kind of notion of what they are providing us and what they get in return, that shifts gradually over time. It's like the analogy of the frog in the bowl or whatever, right? The soup bowl or whatever. Right? So it doesn't notice it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and then it gets cooked. So the same sort of thing, right? We don't necessarily notice. We can get peppered with updates to terms and conditions, agreements that, are we going to go and look and try and sort of work out what's different, and where they've shifted their strategies in order to extract more data or to make more money, monetize that data in different ways and so on. It becomes impossible for us as consumers and as citizens to really manage that kind of arrangement, contractual arrangement. I think someone calculated that if we sign so many of these terms and conditions agreements every year, end user license agreements, all these sorts of, if we read them properly, I think someone worked out it's weeks of our life that we would spend every year reading these agreements, right? So really functionally, we can't do that. We can't download an app, sit there for 20 minutes reading the terms and conditions and then, accept it. And so it would be really interesting. One really interesting thing that I think you could implement as a regulation is that, every time you do download something, you do have to sign a terms and conditions agreement. It would stop you installing whatever it is for the expected reading time of the terms and conditions agreement. If it's an 8,000 word terms and conditions, you can expect to wait an hour on average before you're able to use it, right? And that would pretty quickly, I think, get companies to change the ways that they operate. But obviously, you could imagine the backlash against that, and yes, before they change. So, yeah.
Well, not too many people are reading those, and there's consequences to that for sure. And if we take a look at all the research you're doing, we've spent some good time here talking about assets, assetization. We've talked a little bit about blockchain and the emergence of Web3. If you tie all this together, you're really studying what seems to be a narrative associated with capitalism and maybe some of the structural elements that power capitalism. And I know you've done some research on this, but I'd like to know, how are we doing as humanity and capitalism? Is it working?
Well, it depends what you mean by working. Is it who's it working for, I guess, is one question, right? And so for some people, it works very well. Capitalism is a very messy economic system. It's very hard to kind of pin down clearly the components of capitalism. So, property rights, things like free labor, private contracting, market exchange, all those sorts of things, to pin down them as, in actually existing terms, because there's always an overlay with previous economic systems or with social systems or what have you. So there's always a set of competing, contradictory elements to our economic systems. So capitalism doesn't really exist as capitalism. It always exists as a form of capitalism. And I think that's really important to be clear about, I think, because, we can get very, very different forms of capitalism. They have different consequences for different people. We can contrast much more state-heavy forms of capitalism, like state capitalism. We could think of China, for example, as being a kind of state form of capitalism, and contrast the implications of that with a more kind of corporate capitalism of, say, the US, or a more kind of almost oligopolistic capitalism of Canada. And then you could turn to Europe and think about the coordinated market economies of Germany, the kind of social democratic ones of the Scandinavia, or the kind of, I guess, more financial capitalism of the UK, maybe, right? So lots of different forms of capitalism. There have been several attempts to think of the kind of technological basis of capitalism. And I think that's kind of a useful way of thinking about capitalism, like surveillance capitalism of Shoshana Zuboff, for example, or digital capitalism is another one, platform capitalism. Some thinkers like Nick Chernicek, for example, talks about platform capitalism. And my preference is technoscientific capitalism, and that's to broaden capitalism away from, say, digital or platforms or whatever. So it covers an array of technologies, array of kind of technological innovations and developments. For me, technoscientific capitalism kind of characterizes a form of capitalism in which we have science and technology entangled very much with kind of finance. And so we have this kind of entangling between these two aspects of capitalism. So we have financial logics being very influential in shaping science and technological developments, but we also have science and technology informing the kind of financial or economic kind of side of capitalism as well. There are various kinds of ways that we could characterize this. I like to think of the ways that over time, over the last, at least I'd say 15 years since the global financial crisis. So I think that there's a kind of emergence of what people call a low interest rate regime or system or what have you, the result that the governments pursued after the global financial crisis to kind of pump prime the economy again. I think that's married together with the kind of big tech ascendancy. And so you have both of them are sort of implicated with one another. You have cheap money and the rise of these digital technology, large digital technology firms, and they kind of come together. And I'm not sure why other companies didn't exploit that cheap money, but for some reason, the kind of scaling of the big tech firms on the basis of this cheap capital was, that happened in that sector in particular. So I think that's really, for me, is quite interesting, and the way that what it's, when I'm thinking about assets again, and sorry to return to assets, but thinking about assets again, you see the fact that having a low interest rate regime leads to a search for new kinds of assets, because the assets on which most businesses in the past, the safe assets they used to stick money in, was government bonds, which went down to zero in terms of the returns because of the low interest rates. And so you have this kind of search for other kinds of valuable assets. A lot of money goes into, you've just had the global financial crisis, so you have a housing market crash, a lot of money looking for other kinds of assets. It finds, I think, the kind of, growing tech industry and the stock market is a particularly good place to put, a lot of money, a lot of investment in order to kind of gain some returns. That has a knock-on societal effect in which a lot of society's investment, all that money is investment, right? That's to be invested in something. A lot of that, all that money goes into investing in a particular set of technologies, right? So a particular kind of digital technologies and data-driven technologies, and eventually blockchain, crypto, artificial intelligence, all this kinds of money that's being invested in these kinds of new kinds of technologies. I think that has consequences beyond simply being a search for returns. I think it has a way of shaping those technologies themselves, and you shape technologies in a fashion that turns, businesses strategically look for technologies that are about controlling assets, resources, and so on, creating new kinds of innovations that can do that, or that can create, make it easier to generate repeat revenues from their control over, say, intellectual property, or from their control over data, or their control over whatever it is. And so you end up with this, what I'm starting to think of as a kind of parasitic form of innovation, in which it is more valuable for them to seek ways of controlling, social, resources, not necessarily assets at this point, but sort of exploit social regulations or employment regulations, things like that, or undermine them, or drive out competition. All these sorts of things where you're trying to kind of develop technologies that do these things because they are easier and safer to create than to create new products and services that risk no one being interested in and no one buying, and so on. So you have this kind of shift in a way of thinking about what innovation is. And I can think there's some good examples of this, and I think there's some that I like to pick on, and some that are probably maybe it's unfair, I don't know. But things like printers, right? A printer, they've turned into a form of sort of rent-seeking devices that, you have to repeatedly buy ink that's incredibly expensive to buy and to, use. And each ink cartridge doesn't last very long, and, costs a fortune, and it's repeat business, and that's very valuable. And then printer companies, they deliberately design their printers or their software, their updates to clog the machines if if generic ink is used. Things like that, which are very specific strategies to control the way we use the things we buy in order to generate more revenues. And we can see it across increasing number of our technologies that we use. Printers is just one example. Another major example is tractors. The installation of electronic software in tractors, and then the control over who can repair them. That's been a big debate in farming communities, and a big kind of issue with the right to repair movement. There's cars. I think BMW was going to charge for subscription for a heat warming use, I guess. So all these sorts of things that you can start as a company, you can start thinking of ways to generate new revenues by installing new kinds of systems in place to extract that little bit of extra economic rent. Yeah.
Well, Kean, I only have one final question for you before I get to ask you the GRT IQ 10. And this question is about some of the topics that we've discussed here. And of course, a lot of the topics in your research. And I've put a lot of links in the show notes for anybody that wants to do a deeper dive here on all the great things you've written and studied in the course of your career. But do you think, as you think about the emergence of cryptocurrency, the emergence of blockchain, these types of technologies, do you think they have the potential to solve the problems or resolve the quote unquote sins of big tech and Web 2 and the abuse of personal data and some of these types of things, capitalism?
Yeah, a lot of kind of issues there. I guess there's some things that I find really interesting about tokenization, for example. And I think that there's some really interesting things that people are doing with alternative asset classes. But I think that they're still within the capitalist framework. So I think that they're probably not going to but they're not going to solve the problems of capitalism, if you like. Thinking speculatively, I've thought for a while about how do we rethink capitalism in an entirely fundamentally different way. And I started thinking about, what it would mean to shift what we pay for in capitalism, right? So we shift away from paying for the goods and services we consume to paying for the employment that we pursue, right? So it's instead of paying for your food and your lodgings and so on, you actually pay for your job, right? And what fundamentally would that do if you shifted society in that such a fundamental way that we start paying for the work that we're doing and we get everything else for free, in a sense. And so you start thinking about, you'd have to have some form of relationship between the types of jobs and the amount of resources that you get to consume, that sort of thing, or the amount of resources that are available to that type of job. And so you could work out on the basis of the number of people who want to do what kind of job, right? Does everyone want to be a banker or no one wants to be a cleaner, right? And then you would end up with this kind of system in which, again, you'd balance off the more people who want to be bankers, the less that they would get to consume, and the fewer people who want to be cleaners, the more they get to consume, in a sense. And so you'd have this kind of weird balancing effect, and you'd have to pay for whichever job category you'd want to fall in, and then go and do the work and that sort of thing. Now, I'm still thinking through how it would work, but it's that kind of fundamental rethinking of the whole way that an economy functions that I think is kind of, it's interesting to play with. You could think of ways that maybe tokenization or blockchain would factor into that in terms of how would you go about thinking about the ownership of a job and the ways that you distribute resources on the basis of job categories and so on. So it's a really speculative science fiction kind of idea, but it's a way of how do you fundamentally rethink capitalism in a way that kind of resolves some of these issues. So you'd get to a point if everyone has the resources to live their lives, and everyone gets the food and the housing that they need, and you'd be a different kind of set of concerns that people would have, and it wouldn't be the kind of basic concerns anymore.
Well, I appreciate that perspective as well. And I know that we mentioned early on in the interview that early in your career you studied clusters, and I hope at some point academia will turn their eye towards the emergence of Web3 and this cluster analysis. I'd be very interested in seeing the structural and other things that are happening in certain parts of the world where these clusters are emerging. And in fact, I think it'll be kind of reflective of a global village in the end, where you might have a few places that these clusters exist, but by and large, this was a global village that sort of emerged over time. But anyway, super interesting. And I appreciate all the explanations here, especially on the things you're researching. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I'll put detailed links in the show notes for anybody that wants to dive a little deeper. But Kean, as part of the GRT IQ podcast, I always ask the GRT IQ 10 at the end of each episode. I love to do it because it gives guests the opportunity to kind of share some additional personal things about them and things they're interested in. But as always, I think it gives listeners a chance to learn something new, try something different, or achieve more in their own life. So Kean, are you ready for the GRT IQ 10?
Sure.
The GRT IQ 10. This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
This is a really difficult one. Is it plural or is it singular?
You tell me.
Okay. From a personal perspective, thinking about things and not to do with academia, it really is quite a hard one to pin down. So I'm going to say one book I think I found really interesting. I think it's called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. It's a strange book about somebody who has a conversation with a gorilla. And it's a parable, I guess, of kind of human existence and how we got to where we are. And it's a kind of interesting dissection of society and the implications of societies and the differences between different kinds of societies and so on. So, and I was reading it when I was 21, I think. It was really interesting and sort of eye-opening at that time in my life. If I had to choose an academic book, I would probably say maybe something like the Postmodern Condition by Jean-François Lyotard. So he's a postmodernist or post-structuralist French philosopher. He wrote this report on knowledge for the Quebec government back in 1979. University of Manchester Press, I think, published it as a book in 1984. What I found really interesting is I read this at university and I kind of enjoyed it. You know, as I go through my career, I keep on going, oh, hang on a sec. What? He's already said it. He said it again, right? He's already talking about this. So he's talking about, it's a report on knowledge, and it's a report on knowledge in the light of the kind of coming revolution that computers and digital technologies will have. And so what's really interesting is the way it's kind of, it doesn't predict, but it kind of has this very useful analytical framework for actually understanding what has happened since then, and in a way that seems quite prescient. It's unexpected to see from somebody writing back in 1979. What's really funny about it, though, is that I think Lyotard himself said it's his worst book. It's his most well-known book, and he said that he was just making stuff up, almost, right? So he didn't really know what he was talking about. Maybe not making stuff up, but he didn't really know what he was talking about. But I still find that kind of interesting, is that you can come in as a philosopher and be like, oh, okay, that sounds interesting. Oh, how does that? Oh, yeah, okay. There's these implications. I get back to it quite regularly because I'm like, yeah, I'm sure Lyotard said something about this somewhere. That's interesting. So I think those two would be, yeah.
Amazing. And how about this? Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
I'm going to choose a new one, I think. One TV show I thought was really excellent was a TV series called Lovecraft Country. And I can't remember whether it's HBO or not, but it was a sort of horror set in the 1960s America, and it's kind of mashing together kind of, I guess, racism and horror at the same time in 1960s America. I found it really insightful and very kind of interesting at the same time.
Well, then how about this one, Kean? If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
I'm going to go for And Justice for All by Metallica. I listen to it a lot. I can probably listen to it a lot more. So, yes.
Metallica's come up here plenty of times. And how about this one? What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
So, yeah, this is from a professor during my master's, a guy called Donald Mackenzie, who I guess probably got me into science and technology studies in the first place because he was my lecturer at Edinburgh when I was an undergraduate. His advice was, and this is particularly about academic writing, his advice was show, don't tell. When you're trying to make a point, you don't have to over-explain things. You can just be like, here's what somebody says, or here's a piece of text that illustrates the point. And then, rather than just being like trying to shove it down people's throats, you are providing them with the kind of evidence which they can interpret, and they can, disagree with you or agree with your interpretation of it. It's been useful ever since for me, at least in my career.
And I'm a little trepidatious to ask a scholar this, but I still want to know the answer. But what's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
One thing that has served me well is the fact that clever people have stupid ideas. That's a very important thing to remember, because I think that we often get blindsided by cleverness. And so I think that the fact that there is no correlation between how clever someone is and how good their ideas are is, I think, an important one to remember. I, in fact, think that very clever people are actually very good at promoting very bad ideas because they're very clever. That's stood me in good stead, as, remember, clever people can have stupid ideas. So, yeah.
And what's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Sort of annual planning. It sounds really boring, but especially for writing and to being productive, I think. So every year I create a kind of annual plan of what I'm intending to do in each month, but what I'd like to do in each month, right? And then I cross them out as I go. And at the end of the year, I look at what I've done and what I've not. It's quite useful just working out why I was able to achieve certain things or why not. And also gives me a structure to the year. That helps in terms of forcing me to concentrate at certain times on certain things. Yep.
And based on your own life experiences and observations, what's the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains how or why people find success in life?
Yeah, I think that's probably like drive, being driven, especially in academia. There's plenty of very, very clever people who don't survive in academia, I guess, because it can be quite cutthroat almost, in the sense that you're kind of competing. Like a lot of jobs, there are only so many jobs in universities. It's not just having the intellectual capacity, you have to have that drive. And if you don't have the drive, then it can be difficult. Yeah. But I think that's probably most areas of life, not life, but areas of activity or areas of work. Yeah.
And then, Kean, the final 3 questions are complete the sentence type questions. I'm going to modify the first one that I usually ask to fit your research, because I think we'd be more interested to hear your interest and your vision for this. So the first one is, the thing that most excites me about the future of assets is what?
How we understand society and societal resources. And so we can understand things in particular ways, and we can understand them as these, as investments. And sometimes that's bad. And other times it can actually help us focus our, attention on things. And so I think that sometimes, as long as we do it right, I think if we're thinking about, certain things that we want to preserve and we want to conserve and we want to protect as assets, it can be, a way to govern them.
And how about this one? If you're on X, formerly known as Twitter, you should be following...
Yeah, someone recently that I started following, who I've really started enjoying their work, is a guy called Ed Zitron, Zitron, who writes I think it's either a Substack or some sort of free newsletter, and very interesting and perhaps a little controversial, but it's kind of interesting, kind of takes on a lot of technology, mostly AI at the minute, but yeah.
And then the final question, Kean, I'm happiest when?
It probably is when I'm living in the present. So I think that I have a tendency to be a sort of A to B kind of person, where I'm always thinking about how do I get to B the fastest, right? And rather than just enjoying getting from A to B. So that kind of living in the present, I think, I enjoy that when I'm remembering to do it. Yes.
The GRT IQ 10.
And I show you how deep.
Well, Kean Birch, thank you so much for joining the GRT IQ podcast, for sharing a lot of the research you've been working on and some of the ideas that you have about capitalism and personal data and, of course, assetization. I appreciate you taking the time. If listeners want to learn more about you, follow some of the work that you're doing, what's the best way for them to stay in touch and access some of the things that you're researching?
I have a personal website. I think it's keanbirch.net. And I have a Twitter, Kean Birch. And those are probably the best ways to check out what I'm doing.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRT IQ Podcast.